Okay, prior to panel discussion 1, let me briefly explain how the discussion goes on. Panel discussion 1 will last for 70 minutes. Each winning team will be allocated 5 minutes for presentation during the first 15 minutes, followed by 10-minute remarks by 2 panel discussants. Immediately after the presentation and remarks, a panel discussion will be held for 20 minutes, which will be moderated by Mr. Taylor Reynolds. And please tweet your questions and opinions in real time during the discussion, and we will answer them right after the discussion. Please leave your questions by using your Twitter account and put hashtag. The address of hashtag is YFSCC. For example, you could ask a question like, what is the effect of broadband penetration on economic growth? So please participate actively. And your active participation will be highly appreciated. After responding to tweets, we will have a question and answer sessions with our audience. Okay, today's panel discussion is comprised of 3 categories. From each category, the best delegation will be selected and given a golden opportunity of delivering a speech at the joint plenary with Youth Forum of the Seoul Conference on Cyberspace 2013 to be held in October. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our judges for panel discussion 1. First off, Director Lee Hee-jin of Yonsei University Center for International Studies will take the lead of judges. Now, I kindly ask you to give a big hand to each judge I now mention to you. Dr. Nam Sang-yeol of the Korea Information Society Development Institute. Professor Park Yoon-jung of the State University of New York, Korea. Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the first panel discussion. Panel discussion 1 will be moderated by Mr. Taylor Reynolds. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. I'll do a quick introduction of each of the speakers before they speak, but I won't take very long because I think it's more important to hear from them. We'll start with Suhyoon. Miss Lee is actually an honors student who is spent most of her time growing up, it looks like, abroad in Hong Kong, in many parts of China. She is proficient in Mandarin and French as well as English and Korean. She has many awards and earned a scholarship where she spent actually 3 weeks in Turkey learning about watching what happens there in Turkey and bringing it back as part of the Turkish UWC student trip. So thanks. We'll hear from you first about you have 5 minutes to talk about your essay.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to first warn you that you might find the scope of this essay somewhat quite broad because the way I interpreted the prompt was to give an overview analysis of the Internet's economic impact and social impact as well. So I started the essay by discussing the merits. Sorry, is there a good presentation? I first started the essay by discussing the merits of the Internet's communication channel, which is instantaneous, eliminates distance and borders, and is free as long as you have Internet access. And obviously this brings huge operational and sales benefits for firms. And the example I took to demonstrate this efficiency was Tmall. And basically it partnered with the US Department of Agriculture and used an innovative online pre-order model to offer food products at a higher quality and cheaper price than any of its counterpart retail stores offering the same imported product in China. And then next I considered how the Internet changed the dynamics in marketing and arrived at the first conclusion that it does create a more level playing field due to the lower costs in advertising through the Internet compared to other traditional media channels. However, this may sound like it helps small startup firms and individuals, as we saw with several examples from the previous presentation, but we must also consider the multiplied presence of open customer feedback and online reviews, which I think would create a more competitive environment, which would expose the likely price and quality disadvantages of small startup firms compared to multinationals. And when you look at industries like the smartphone industry, you see this monopoly with Samsung and Apple rather than other firms being able to enter. But however, you do get more informed consumers who will make choices that support a meritocratic system that favors true innovation. Afterwards, I considered the economic benefits of the internet in post-crisis developing nations like Haiti, and I first identified the two short-term benefits, which is that they can accept foreign aid electronically and gather real-time data for efficient reconstruction efforts. And then the long-term benefits of using information and communication availability to establish a sense of security and certainty among the population as well as the foreign investors. Finally, as the last part of the first section of this essay dealing with the economic impacts, I looked at the popular argument against the internet economy, which is the decline and the unemployment in the manufacturing sector. And if you look specifically at the digitalization of media content, and people today, when we take photos, we do not print them physically, but now we upload them and share them on social media sites. And naturally, so firms like Kodak are on the verge of bankruptcy. And when you compare the figures, you see that the lost jobs do not seem to have been directly replaced by the IT industry. And I think this is partly because firms like Facebook, the nature of the service that's provided is quite automated, and it only requires the routing work of a few central computers. And we see a similar trend in the recording and the publishing industry as well. But despite this data, the essay concludes by stating that the internet has a broader positive impact on the economy because of its influence on other markets and industries like the market for leisure and the renewable energy sector, as we complete what I would call a gradual and revolutionary transition into a new tertiary service-based economy. Next, we move on to the second chunk of the essay and dealing with the social impact. Although China is well known for censorship and banning foreign social media like Facebook, it has a thriving domestic counterpart like Weibo and Weixin. And when you look at the case study here, exemplifies how internet forums can mobilize civic-minded citizens against government corruption and push for democratic accountability through the openness and the viral nature of use of any sort of injustice and corruption posted on the internet. And I won't go into the details of the case because of the time limit, but in the next case study of the Arab Spring, which I witnessed a bit in Turkey, I took a much more critical look at the role of the internet as a democratic tool. Because as internet users increase in autocratic nations with high youth unemployment, these online mobilizations will definitely make it easier to start revolutions, but that does not take us away from the fact that there are other requirements to a successful and sustainable democratic transition, such as the existence of an opposition that is competent and organized and has the competence to fill in the leadership void. And basically, this means that the viral nature of online mobilizations could lead to premature demonstrations as well as raising false expectations. And I cited the current situation in Egypt as an example of this. Finally, I wrapped up the essay by looking at the key security threats of cyberspace, such as hate speech, organized crime, and the use of online training and recruitment by terrorist groups. And then I suggested measures for sustainable and secure expansion that does not sacrifice individual and national security. And these include a structured IT education and training, and a certain level of government regulation to increase the level of accountability, and international cooperation between national bodies to share data and protection mechanisms. And I think this is something that definitely needs a renewed effort in, especially after the recent Edward Snowden incident. And in conclusion, I believe that the internet economy will propagate the world into a new level of economic prosperity and social well-being. However, the transition process will definitely require regulation and cooperation at an international level to overcome the security threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. We'll now move on to Kyungwoong, who is going to speak to us today on the global digital divide and limited effects of the internet. Mr. Guo has experience from Hana Investment Bank, did an internship, and also at Columbia University Protemics Research internship. Quite interesting. He attends Underwood International College here at Yonsei University. Look forward to the presentation.
So up to now, we have talked about the positive effects of the internet in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, in terms of how it can change and empower the individual. Now, we could say the same things for trains. We could say the same thing for electricity. It has helped people's lives beyond calculable measure, perhaps. But the question is, what about people who don't live near train tracks? What about people who don't live near electricity circuits? And my talk today will be about how the global digital divide, in which people who don't have access to the internet are missing out on the benefits of the internet. So firstly, let's talk about what the global digital divide is. It's basically defined as how different nations have international and differences in information and communication technology diffusion. We can measure this through several statistics, for instance. For instance, we see that in the developed world, around 70% of people have access to the internet or are currently actively using the internet. But you particularly see this in the global south, South and Central America, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. And when you look at figures like these, taken from the International Telecommunications Union back in 2011, you see that there are global divisions on how easily people can access the internet. The developing world currently, or at least according to 2011 statistics, have less than a quarter of its people being able or having active access to the internet. We still have to recognize that in some countries we have even less than 10% of the people having a stable internet connection. So then the question is, why do these digital divides happen in the first place? And I looked at this in two parts. Firstly is mainly macroeconomic factors, because we have to recognize that different nations have different levels of wealth, they have different levels of economic development, and they have different levels of national investment in ICT. And that these pre-existing economic differences, such as how much a nation has, for instance, telephone lines or active telephone companies before the introduction of the internet, has actually led to this difference in infrastructure and this difference in people being able to access to the internet. And sometimes in some countries you even see monopolies within telecommunications, which actually hinders people's access to the internet. Whereas in some nations like South Korea, and I believe Costa Rica to some extent, they have taken active policies to break up monopolies within telecommunications, and this has led to competition with these companies, which actually brings me on to the second point about microeconomic factors. Because sometimes these access to the internet costs a lot, and when you consider that there are differences in income among the world, there's difference in an ability for people to pay for internet access. And obviously in these cases, the poor are not able to access the internet. So when you don't have full internet diffusion along the society, what you usually see is that it's the rich after the intellectuals. When you're talking about the whole of society, it's usually the rich people, the urban dwellers, the political class who has access to the internet. And an internet which is only accessible to, say, something like half the population is sometimes even more devastating than not having internet at all. So what do I mean by this? Firstly, let's look at the economic consequences. We recognize that the internet is quite important when it comes to the economy. We have faster access to information. We have easier access to who's selling the cheapest goods, who's selling the most suitable goods for me and for companies and for individuals. But when you look at the internet economy, and this is something that a lot of previous literature has somehow failed to neglect, is that the internet economy favors developed nations rather than developing nations who don't have as many people accessing the internet, who can't really benefit from reaping the possibilities and the possibilities that the internet provides to them. latest McKinsey report in 2013, I believe, it said that the internet accounted for 21% of GDP growth, but particularly within the most connected nations, in the G8, in South Korea, and Sweden, Brazil, China, and India. But when you consider that that you have the digital divide, when you have some nations people within some nations not really being able to access the internet, I think that this might even lead to a wider wealth gap between nations. Because when you consider the internet, for example, it takes a lot of money to actually set up a company and set up all the infrastructure. But once you set up the infrastructure, it's quite cheap to actually buy a spot on the internet to host your own website or something. And what happens is that currently existing large firms within developed nations take the initiative and they actually use this to enter markets within developing nations. As it turns out then, is that developed nations have gained more from the internet than compared to developing nations. And we also can see political consequences. When you consider that people not being able to access to the internet and therefore access to the latest news and what politicians are doing and all these kinds of things, it leads to a sort of digital illiteracy, and this might lead to social inclusion. But perhaps a more important part to recognize is that when we recognize that the internet severely lowers the cost of people of similar political ideology, for instance, being able to associate with each other, it means that when only the rich have access to this internet, it's easier for the rich to actually come together as a force and actually promote policies in their favor, as opposed to the poor people, the majority of the population who don't have access to the internet. And sometimes when you consider that the political class is the first people are the first people to have access to the internet, it sometimes even means that it's easier for the state to control the internet when you don't have as many people using it, and therefore there's a smaller internet traffic, which is easier to, for instance, to censor the internet. For instance, in China and sometimes Malaysia, we have seen active censorship. In Cuba, for instance, or at least until the recent past, what happened is that the internet, because so few people were using the internet, it actually acted as an agency of state propaganda, silencing the political opposition. But I'm not here to tell you that the internet is a bad thing. What I want to conclude is that basically all this really occurs because the internet is not fully spread among the populace. Not everybody has access to it. And so what I hope this conference answers, among many other questions, is how do we as an internet, how do we use this network and basically benefit the most people possible? How do we give access of the internet to the most people possible, especially within these developing nations, especially when they need to gain access to the internet in order to gain the benefits of the internet. The train benefited people only because people lived near train tracks. Electricity lines only benefited people because everybody had access to electricity. Let's make it the same for the internet. Thank you.
One of you that would want to go first, and then we'll move backwards. Was there anyone else who'd like to take a first shot at that?
Sure. Hello. My message would be to open up the system for international cooperation. I'll commend Korea for opening up the system for interaction, because especially in developing countries, you have the financial muscle to develop the infrastructure is very high, and with cooperation discussions like this, you will have things opening up, investments in the system. But government need to open up the system, put up interesting phenomenal incentives to see that things work.
Excellent. So, developing a system for international cooperation, similar probably to these type of fora, or the forum we're in today, where it's excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Is there someone else who'd like to take number 2? Next.
This is a completely new idea that hasn't been brought up in the discussion, but something that I really want to mention, because I believe that the internet economy creates for us certain information that previously did not exist, that we can definitely use for the social good. But the only concern is that when we use this sort of information, and by this information I mean things like the information held by mobile phone operators, will have text messages, digital cash transaction records, and transmission location records as well. But caution must be taken, and these telecommunication operators must first partnership with the government to strip this information of personally identifying information and then use them. And the success story that I want to share with you is this company called Orange, who released 2.5 billion records of calls and text messages between anonymous cell phone users in the Awele coast. And this led to a global contest involving universities, research groups, think tanks, and the development category winner was the IBM team, who analyzed all the travel patterns using the location data and suggested changes to the bus route, which would reduce the average commute time by 10%. And I believe this is a great example of how we can achieve social efficiency and in social good. And I believe the government can use this.
Okay, thank you very much. So essentially, looking for new sources, we can use big data, analyze it, and use it for good within the government side. Okay, excellent. Mr. Bill?
Yes, now, this is a very controversial topic and it's one that's still being discussed, but I personally favor that governments try to find ways of allowing people to access the internet for even cheaper. So we already have internet in public libraries, and that's a good thing. But this is particularly interesting because a lot of nations haven't done this yet. In nations like Chile, nations like Netherlands, what they've done is they've passed a network neutrality law, basically saying that, well, what happens in the status quo is that people have to actually pay extra money to access Skype, to make calls, that kind of thing. And basically what the government is now passing as a law is don't charge any differently those Skype calls, those online video things. Treat all data basically the same and charge them exactly the same. I think that's actually one of the contributing reasons why, for instance, when you look at nations with internet penetration rates, I think the Netherlands is about has the highest internet penetration rates concerning internet users over 5 million within that nation, excluding small nations like Falkland Islands or Iceland.
So essentially, you're for promoting net neutrality laws as a way to make people use services so they don't have to pay extra for these top services. Okay, thank you very much. Jeff?
I think the government, from looking for these conferences and discussion that it should promote its e-government scheme. One of the key advantages of the internet and cyberspace is that there's more access to information, more data, and that way the government, as Mr. Reynolds mentioned before, that the government can make wrong decisions that's not aligned with the market. So with good internet economy and good cyberspace, the internet and the government can make better decisions, make pro-market decisions for the economy itself.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Okay.
I want to talk about the situation of the internet, especially for searching engine. And if there's anyone who wants to buy or rent a room, you go to the internet and look for real estate in 114 in Korean, Busan Isa. But labor were down. Right after the kind of sites grow enough, they took over the companies. So as a student who study economics, they think perfect competition makes more time or makes more profit. And government's the top priority job of government is to regulate the monopoly system.
Okay, very much. Thank you very much for we heard from each of the three teams and the discussions there. I think those were very good answers. We are running a bit behind schedule, so now it's time for some questions from the audience. If you have questions from the panel, we'll take a couple questions and then we will move on to a final word from each of the teams. So I'd ask for any questions or comments from the audience. Like there's pretty much summed it up. Yeah, no questions? Oh, yes, we can.
There's a lot of talk about the digital divide. What's the best way to ensure that the divide can be closed that doesn't hinder already developing countries or developed countries?
So how can you address the digital divide without hindering developing countries or developed?
Developed, or the ones that are already seeing upward momentum from the internet economy.
Anyone have a comment they'd like to make?
I believe that the digital divide is already closing, partly because of the technological innovation. And now you see that simple mobile devices, rather than smartphones and laptops that are very cheap, can still provide internet access. And there's a very clear profit incentive for private sector firms to come in and set up the 4G towers and set up the broadband connection.
I think we call it leapfrog, where they able to come with 3G next time.
Well, I think at the heart of the issue of digital divide between the developing and developed countries is the issue of costs. You see that, especially as Taylor showed in his presentation, the issue of Ghana, it's pretty much the same across several developing countries. So I think if the issue of cost is addressed, there'll be more mobile penetration in developing countries.
Thank you very much. We have a Twitter question that came in from Idong-Uk that says, are there local logistics companies working with e-commerce websites to deliver goods to all connected people in Africa? Are there examples?
Yes, there are Konga, we have Dalefish, Jumia. These are the few prominent ones that are operating in Africa, but the innovativeness is opening up the market for new commerce to drive.
And how do these sites work? Do you pay do you buy on the internet or on a mobile or a PC with a mobile phone?
The biggest now is Jumia. Unfortunately, because of trust, we've not yet have trust in our payment systems. People prefer goods delivered and they pay for it, but the order is made on the internet. While the federal government, the government of Nigeria, through the central bank, has commenced an cashless economic policy, which enforces because it's enforcing it now, that payments for essential goods should go through the cyberspace so that monitoring can be done and to drive the penetration far deeper into the market to drive it.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Jasmine Bazette, who says, what is the best way to close the digital divide that does not include hindering already developed nations?
Sorry.
Essentially the same question. What can we do to make sure that we don't hurt what's going on in developed countries in order to bring developing countries to the same level?
I believe that developed nations also have an incentive to include developing nations into the internet economy, because when you look at it, the more participants there are, when you take things like social media, the more value it gets. And when developed countries want to support their IT industries, they need to help them expand their sales and expand their customer base, and that can be done through developing nations' participation as well.
Anyone else who wants to tackle that?
I think funding as well. Problem with, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of the funding from banks don't go to the IT sector, they go to consumer spending. So there's higher returns and there's a bigger economy in that. So I think funding should be redirected and there should be more incentives to promoting those sectors, and even foreign investors should come in.
Anyone else want to take that? Close? Good. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll go for final comments from each of the teams. We have 3 minutes just for a final word, for a final summary of your thoughts from each of the three teams, and then we'll close the session. So why don't we start with Mr. Ko?
Yes. Now, as much as we like to talk about the internet economy and internet also affecting politics, before that we need to actually get people accessing the internet, and that was basically what my essay was about. About what is the problem when we don't have all of the people being able to access to the internet? It's basically the economic differences and the political differences between, say, the rich and the poor, the urban dwellers and the political class and the citizens. These differences happen, and these wealth gaps or political gaps only worsen only because not everybody has access to the internet. Now, that's not to say that the internet itself is a bad thing. It's just that if as much as it's a network good, as we talk about, or basically it gains value by more people using it, more people entering it, we should make policies so that more people can enter or have access to the internet, and basically have more people being able to reap the benefits of the internet. And this is why I talked about the network neutrality law, where basically it allows people from not having to pay extra money just to talk to their friends or family, or even use for business conferences on Skype. We're talking about things like how do we incentivize the telecommunications market itself, so that people can actually, so that we don't just have a monopoly of telecommunications. We have actually different companies competing with each other, either on price or either on quality or network or internet speed or things like that. So basically, I think that before we talk about the private sector and what the e-commerce and e-health people can do about it, before that we need to start from the more basic. How do we get the infrastructure? How do we get governments to incentivize these telecommunication industries? And that's basically what I hope this conference at least tries to shed light upon and answer some of the questions that we had in our minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would your team like to go second?
In conclusion, we've seen examples from all the team members shows that the internet is an engine of economic growth and development in developing countries, which is the focus of our study. But I think it's also very important to know that most studies focus on assessing the contribution of the internet from a macroeconomic standpoint, more or less focusing on its contribution to income improvement. But if we look at it from a broader sense, from a development perspective, we see that when we talk about economic growth and development, it goes beyond income. It includes so many dimensions of human deprivation, such as healthcare, education, participation, and the whole lot out there. So I think the focus should shift a little bit from just focusing on income improvements. Because there could be, for instance, in Africa, presently six of the fastest 10 growing economies in the world in Africa. But has this growth translated into improvement in people's lives? That's a different question. Legal frameworks are important, institutional frameworks. The government has to be the driver in this regard. And it's also important, as I mentioned, that the internet has to be combined with other innovative strategies to drive growth and development in developing countries. Thank you.
I believe that the internet economy has huge potential, especially in the e-commerce sector. I was actually quite shocked by Mr. Reynolds' presentation when he said only 10% of companies use e-commerce at the moment. And I also believe that training is essential to close the transitional unemployment that exists. But we should also keep in mind that there's no better example of anarchy than the internet. Hundreds of millions of people post and disseminate information every day. And it was really interesting to hear when Mr. Awele mentioned how civil society can actually, rather than the government, can also intervene and fix social wrongs. And this reminded me of the human flesh search engines in China, where people actually track down social wrongdoers and public officials with sort of like mob rule. It's a bit macabre, but it's still quite effective. But we should also keep in mind that there are some dangers and caution has to be taken. And as a final word, in terms of the income gap of the internet economy, I believe that the internet will not solve the income gap, but it will definitely take away some of the more entrenched causes of this gap, such as opportunity in education and opportunities in business. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just conclude with some of the key points, the 4 points that I think just came out of these discussions that I think we can use as ideas to take forward. There was a big idea that came forward about cooperation. The internet really is about collaboration, so our internet policy should also be about collaboration and cooperation. So I thought that was an extremely good point. We also need to make government and policy people aware of the potential of big data, and then governments have a role to play in making sure that big data is not abused, but that it's used efficiently. So that's something that's a key policy issue to come out. We need to create an environment for access that promotes the access to new services, whether this be through some sort of legislation about net neutrality was one suggestion, but how can we create an environment that allows for new services to pop up and people to be able to use them? I think that's very important. And then one of the other key issues that came up that I picked out was funding from other countries. So there was a question that came up 2 times from 2 different groups saying, how do developing countries and developed countries progress together in the internet economy? It sounds like funding is a problem. So maybe an area where we can work is ensuring that funding from the developed world can actually make it down to entrepreneurs and startups in developing countries over the internet to help fund some of these ventures and bring money into the system. So with that, I'd like to close the panel today, and if you can all give a warm round of applause for the panelists and discussants. They did an excellent job today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we will have a luncheon. Please check the location of the luncheon hall that is marked on your luncheon voucher, and follow the direction of our staff to the Crazy Brown, which is located